Hello, everybody. My name's Eric. I'm in recovery. I woke up this morning with this thought of creating or doing a live stream tonight and getting through the steps quicker. It seems quicker, but it's really not quick as they did in the early days of AA. This is for anybody who has a desire to get sober, and specifically more in the area of lust. What do I say? I want to start by saying I'm only just carrying a message. These are not my ideas, hopefully. They're just the ideas that have been tried and true over the years. And I've had personal experience with this, and for 8 years tried to do things without letting go of my own ideas. And I didn't even know I was holding on to my own ideas. I didn't even know I was trying in my own strength to do this. It was just like a nightmare. I really almost never thought I would get sober. Then I somehow surrendered. I decided to just not know anything. And a good prayer for this is called the set aside prayer. God, help me set aside everything I think I know about you. Help me set aside everything I think I know about myself. Help me set aside everything I think I know about this disease and everything I think I know about the steps. Grant that I may know you as you really are, myself as I really am, the disease as it really is, and the true steps for healing. So we're just going to move right into this. I'm going to try to take away any extra stuff that's my stuff and just try to get right to the steps. I will say just a little thing about the AA book. It's now public domain, and so now there's copies being made where the page numbers don't really line up with anything. So it's going to be really important to just get a plain old AA book that looks like this. And the pages will line up no matter what edition it is. The first 164 pages are identical. And that's how we find our way around. To begin with a little bit, this is a program of action. So what's so different about this is we may have been going to meetings for years, but if we're just trying to get more knowledge or understanding or analyze, it doesn't really work. This is more like a to-do or cookbook. You just do what it says literally, and it'll work. If we try to figure it out, that's a form of pride, and pride is what causes us the most problems. And we'll talk a lot about it, but pride is not just, hey, look at me, I'm a wonderful person. It's really us having an inflated sense of self. So if I'm too bad a person, that's still an obsession with self. I like what C.S. Lewis says, is that true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking about yourself less. So the steps help us to empty ourselves of ourself, and in hopes that the Holy Spirit, or what AAers or even the early church called the grace of God, would come to us and rescue us. So those who are Christians that have heard lots of verses about grace, we're saved by grace. It's literally this power. It's not to be confused with this idea that we get out of jail, get a get out of jail card free. Nope, it's actually acquiring this divine energy. There's certain essential elements of recovery. The early days of AA, or it wasn't even AA, it was Oxford groups, and there were 4 major processes. The first one was surrender, just absolute surrender, letting go of control, not trying in any way to your own power. It was emptying yourself. And it was unconditional. So there was this idea that, like when a country gets bombed to smithereens and there is no way for them to even survive except unconditional surrender. That's what this is like. We either surrender or we die. And it feels very counterintuitive to us because we feel that I've got to hold on, I got to work the program, I've got to do this and this and this. And if we don't understand the program, we'll go to a meeting and then we all try to encourage each other. This is not a support group. 12-step groups are more, each person's doing what God's grace is encouraging them to do and following the steps. But I can't really help someone else get sober. And we'll talk about this, might as well talk about it now. In the early days, you would have had 2 sponsors. Your sponsors would have lasted about a month, maybe 2 months, maybe longer, but it was not this long-term relationship. They certainly weren't a therapist. Their role was to get you through the steps. The sponsors would have greeted you at a hospital, most likely. And we're talking AA here, and we'll convert it to lust in a minute. They would have come to the hospital, actually dressed in suits, 2 of them. And they would have asked, hey, is there someone with alcohol that we can help? And then they would show up, and if the person wanted to visit. And what would happen is there'd be each man or, a woman, but it started off with a lot of men, would share their own story, share what God had done for them. And then they'd ask, do you feel like you want what we have? And most likely at that state of mind, yes. And then they would say, well, are you willing to admit you're powerless over alcohol, that you can't stop, that you've tried everything and you just can't? And the person probably say, yes, they just did step 1. Step 2 would be, then, do you believe that there's some power greater than yourself? Do you believe in God? And if the person said yes, then they just did step 2. If they didn't believe in God, then they would gently and prayerfully help the person to even at least explore the idea. And they would do so in such a way that would be respectful, to not get bogged down in different denominational understandings of God. But this was never meant to be defining your own God. If you're defining your own God, if it's the God of your own definition, that's not God. This book precisely says the God of your own conception. God himself often is anonymous at first to people. They really don't know who he is. But with time, when they pray to this God who they really don't know, they start to then get sober, and they start to go, whoa, God's real. And for those of us who may have actually been Christians, we may be struggling for years, but when we start to have the power of God work in our lives in this way, we go, my gosh, he's really real. So that's what they talked about, a spiritual experience. And in step 3, they would have had the person, if they were ready to turn their whole life over to the care of God. It was not like just surrendering alcohol. No, you surrendered the whole everything. If the person did this, then and they prayed a prayer, and then next day they'd be up and visiting them. They'd say, well, this will be good, but it won't really last long if we don't look at things that are blocking your relationship with God. And they understood that what they really needed was divine power, divine energy, that you could believe in God, but you actually needed power from on high. So what are the things that they discovered that blocked God's power? And these you can find in the Bible for those that are interested, but one is unforgiveness. If we have resentments, holding on to grudges, it blocks God's power. 2, if we're dishonest, if we lie in any way, if we lie to ourselves, we lie to others, it all falls apart. If we're holding something back from like a spouse, this is a common one. The person wants to recover but not share that even with their spouse they're in recovery. I've just never seen it work. There's a special process for that. You just don't go willy-nilly, dump all that stuff on your poor spouse, but there's a way to do it. And it doesn't mean you have to share with everybody under the sun. It's just that there ought to be one person you share everything with. And this was sharing. And that's why the groups in the early days were not a circle of chairs. The circle of chairs and all that was invented in the 60s by, psychotherapy, which actually makes 12 steps less effective. And we'll talk about that later. Yeah, if you went to an AA meeting, well, and we'll get through this, what happened here. So they're at the hospital. They would come back and write out their 4-step. There was never this, here's your book, you go write it out yourself, get back with me. Absolutely not. You did this in probably 3 to 4 hours. And often your sponsor did the writing. They would say, okay, who are you mad at? I'm mad at my parents. I'm mad at God. I'm mad at the church. I'm mad at the government. I'm mad. Okay. And that's as simple as it got. We'll talk more about step 4. But basically, what you got from step 4 is a list of your not defenses, but defects of character. The defects of pride, arrogance, I'm too sensitive, I'm insensitive, I'm selfish, I'm fearful, I'm catastrophic, I'm controlling, I'm self-pitying, on and on, resentful. Those things block God's power. So unless those things are removed, you won't stay sober. 5, 6, 7 are really micro steps, really. The original 4 processes were just very simple. And people for 4 years got sober. They didn't even know about 12 steps. And they were in Oxford groups, and eventually they left. But you would have, in that second day, done 4th step, then you would have asked God to remove these defects of character. In fact, the original wording in the AA book was humbly ask God to remove these defects on our knees. Humbly on our knees. Yeah. So they would have had a prayer session and asking God to remove my selfishness, to be replaced with love, or whatever the opposite is. If I'm envious, to be praying for contentment. If I'm controlling, to pray for acceptance and to let go and to trust God and faith. If I'm resentful, to be willing to be forgiving, etc. Anger, to be praying for mildness. At that point, you already kind of know that you have a list of people you've harmed. And that was the 3rd process. And the original word was restitution, which seems like works, but the AA people called it amends. And I do like the word amends. It's mending the relationship. Anybody who struggles with an addiction has harmed people. When actually anybody on the face of the earth has harmed people. What 12 steps encourages us to do is to mend those relationships, to go to our brother or sister, our family members, anybody, and make amends. And they learned that most amends could be done directly. You just go and say, I'm so sorry I lied to you, or I'm sorry I was really disrespectful, or I'm sorry for some where it's a family member, there's a lot to share. And that was written out a lot of times. But the sponsors were actually in the car praying while you're doing this. And back in the old days, people weren't that scattered. And so you would do this in one town in one day often. People's lives were different. They would stop and can we talk? Now, there were some situations where people had so much damage done that it might cause more damage to actually go make amends. So they understood that some things were indirect amends. And this was not necessarily a way out to not face these people. But some people, like in the case of lust, are we going to go back to the people we've harmed by participating in pornography? Probably not. It's going to be more an indirect amends that we might give to an organization that helps sex trafficking or people out of such difficulties. Praying for those people we've harmed every day on our knees, that God would have mercy on them and help them not be harmed by our harms to them. Sometimes the spouse situation, which is a delicate matter, sometimes it's better to get recovery first to make, they say the best amends is continued sobriety, living amends, living one day at a life, one day at a time, a life that's connected with God, asking for, um, you know, God's will to be manifested in our life and the power to carry that out. The last process was guidance, divine energy, guidance, and steps 10 and 11 and 12 kind of reflect this today. And this is where the heart of the program really is. People got through steps. So in a way, you would have gotten through steps 1 through 9 in a week, maybe 2 weeks. At that point, you were considered a recovered alcoholic. Your chances of using again were 50% or 75% or 93%, depending on which part of the country you're at. There was such growth, and I guess we could say the Holy Spirit was working in such a powerful way that people were getting sober left and right. This hit the newspapers. People couldn't believe their eyes. And there were stories of people going in 1 week to minister to a person in the hospital. That person, the very next 2 weeks, were coming in as one of the pairs to help the next person. So the idea of having to have all this sobriety before you can help someone, no. If you read the AA history, you learn that they said nothing will so insure you against another drink as work with others. So somehow helping others gets us out of ourselves. And of course, we balance this out with you can't impart which you don't have. But here's the thing on that. What am I imparting? Recovery? No, absolutely not. Am I imparting sobriety? No. I'm just imparting whatever I have that God's gifted to me. Sobriety is a gift. We can't earn it. It's gifted to us one day at a time. And I'm sorry, this light behind me looks like some halo. It's really bothering me. I have a weird office. Oh, what am I going to do? I think I'll live with this. Sorry, folks, but so what is recovery not? Now, this is going to step on some toes, and I'm not here to argue or anything, but I get people really upset. They're entrenched in, they've gone to meetings 10 years and they're not even more than a month sober. I was one of those, by the way. But it's not sitting around in a circle sharing one's feelings. It's not getting currents. It's like, if I just download everything bad that's happened this week, then I'll stay sober. That's therapy. Therapy's great. I love the idea of that, and I participate in that. Did it get me sober? No, it's totally, and what do we have? Well, we just look in the rooms. Are people sober multiple years? If they are, great. But if they're not, one has to ask, why are we here? Dr. Bob, who is one of the co-founders of AA in 1950, and you can look this up online. There's an audio of this. He says to the convention, the very first convention, and he was actually dying from cancer at the time, but he said, do not let psychotherapy ruin this simple program. Psychoanalysis and looking at things and analyzing why I acted out and trigger management, and that's pride. That assumes that if I figure this out, then I can get my handle under that. I will be able to manage this and I'll get better. The 12 steps is kind of the opposite of that. It's this place of tearfulness to the point where I just am scared to death. I can't stop. There's nothing I can do. I'm at the end of myself. That's actually a good place to be. And that's why it says many of us held on to our own ideas and the result was nil till we let go. Absolutely. So it was growing by leaps and bounds. And this is what's weird. They had actually beginners groups where there were just 1 hour meetings. And meetings, what did meetings look like, by the way? The circle of chairs was invented in the 60s, but no, there were rows and rows of chairs. And if you see old pictures, they're dressed up, high heels, people, a lot of smoking. But no, it was like people dressed up to go to these things. And they went to an average of one meeting a week. Most likely you did all the steps before you ended up in a meeting. And you had one speaker. That speaker spoke for 1 hour. It was 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and 40 minutes. 10 minutes on what their life was like before recovery, 10 minutes on what they did in terms of step work, and the last 40 minutes was what their life was like today. So it was really a testimonial. The work was done in the steps, and the step work was done daily. You got through steps 1 through 9, and then all you really did is you did 15 to 20 minutes in the morning, 15, 20 minutes at night, and morning prayer and meditation, and evening prayer and meditation. If there was a chart with blue or some kind of bars that showed a bar graph of how much time should be spent on each step, we'd be talking, yeah, this will hopefully work where you see things. You know, first step, second, third, maybe a little bit of fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th. That's what we do. And if you do that, you're screening for 4 things. You're screening for resentments, selfishness, dishonesty, and fear. That's what we focus on. And when those things are removed from us by God's grace, it opens up this channel of God's power. And so, anyway, we'll continue on. It was simple. Dr. Bob kept on saying this is a simple program, and it is more and more simple. I'm shocked how simple it is. It's as I've grown in the program by God's grace, there's days I just don't know what to do. I say I don't know what to do. I get on my knees and say I don't know what to do. I'm powerless over this thing. God, please come help me. And he helps me. In fact, the more I get out of the way, if I can get out of the way, the better it all works. So then that's what Christianity is: self-denial, denying one's everything. We're getting rid of self. Anyway, could go on and on about that. By the way, it's action, not gathering information. It's a spiritual program of action. In the preface, if we want to turn to our books here, this is the harder part when I sponsor people. It's these pages that are Roman numerals, but we'll learn them. So this is 13 in the first preface, the forward to the first edition here. We of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm going to try to be mindful of giving you time to get there, because I really encourage you to grab a pen, and you can put step 1, step 2, step 3, and you go back to it over and over. It's like a cookbook where there's something you need to get to quickly. You just go there. It says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. So what's interesting is that we hear the word recovery. I'm in recovery, I'm recovering. That's not really their experience in the early days. They recovered from this. Didn't mean they were cured, and we'll later read that, but that's page 84, 85. But you recovered. And what happens is if people didn't experience the steps, then they're always relapsing. And then it began to be more a recovery thing. And it's just not effective to think that way. And the book tells us precisely how we have recovered. And there are people that want to argue about this. There's no point in arguing. Scrolling down a little bit, it says, many do not comprehend that the alcoholic or the sexaholic is a very sick person. That stings a bit to hear that. Why does it sting? It's probably because of pride. The reality is, aren't we all very sick people? And you really can't compare, well, that person's sicker than that person. It doesn't really matter. What matters is our level of repentance. And if we change, oh, whoa, the person who could have the worst life possible could end up being a saint. And the person who seems to have less crosses on their life could not take advantage of things. Page xxviii. This is 14, the next page. It says, from this, the doctor, the broker, had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. So it's right there. Though he could not accept all of the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of a need for a moral inventory. That sounds like step 4. Confession of personality defects. That sounds more like step 4. Restitution to those harmed. That's 8 and 9. Helpfulness to others. That's like 12. The necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. So that's, in a way, all the steps, but steps 1, 2, and 3. We'll go to page 28. Which is frothy emotional appeals did not work. This is in the doctor's opinion, written by Dr. Silkworth. We won't spend too much time talking to him, but this I think is important. I have it highlighted here. Frothy emotional appeals seldom suffices. So loved ones can cry their eyes out and say, please, please stop. This is killing us. Or we can try to muster up emotion to try to make herself stop. Yeah, it doesn't work. It says in that paragraph, it says in nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. Going to the bottom of the page, it says men and women drink or lust essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol or lust. The sensation is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, they cannot, after a time, differentiate the true from the false. To them, their alcoholic life or the sexaholic life seems the only normal one. They are restless, irritable, and discontented. That's what they call the natural state of the alcoholic or the sexaholic. We're not really calm people. Maybe we are, I won't talk you out of it, but there's some nervousness, discontentedness. We're not really happy. And we're irritable. And so since day one, we're looking for something to calm ourselves down. We may be looking for food, sex, spending, gambling, whatever. In page, let's see, 28. Yeah, that. Oh, well, it's 29. The next page. We're going to talk about craving. It says, after they succumb to this, it says they are restless, irritable, and discontented until they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks. And in case, just translate it for lust, acting out. Drinks which they see others take without impunity. So the lust addict is saying, well, everybody does this. It's normal. I'm a man or I'm a woman. It's fine to do this, normalizing. And we probably have help from the enemy to make this seem like a normal thing. It says, and they succumb to the desire again, as many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops. They pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful with a firm resolution not to drink or lust again. This is repeated over and over, and I'll add more overs and overs and overs and overs unless this person can experience an entire psychic change. there is very little hope of his recovery. So we're not talking about just a simple behavior. We're talking about a spiritual issue. And if one has an entire spiritual experience which changes them, which is great, we see it every day. I love to help people with this. You'll have an entirely different life. Eventually, cravings get better. It says, on the one hand, as strange as this may seem to those who do not understand, once a psychic change has occurred, that very same, the very same person who seemed doomed, who had so many problems he despaired of ever solving them, suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol or lust. Easily able to control his desire for lust, or the only effort necessary being that he required to follow a few simple rules. So a lot of people are barking up the wrong tree. They're trying to fight lust. And you just don't do that. Just follow God in these steps, and God will remove this, lift this from you. Going down a little bit on the page, it says, faced with the problem, if a doctor is honest with himself, he must sometimes feel his own inadequacy. Although he gives all that is in him, it often is not enough. So this is the therapist or the doctor trying to help the person. One feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. Okay. So we're going to jump ahead here. Craving, xxx. I have this outlined in this way, and you can go through, and if you just look for where it talks about these different types of alcoholics, you'll find that there's different types of sexaholics. And we won't spend time on them. But there's phrases like they're overly remorseful and making many resolutions, but never a decision. They seem normal in every aspect except when it comes to this. Now, there are words like psychopaths who are emotionally unstable. That word doesn't mean what we think about it today, meaning they were unstable. If we just go down here, all these and many others have one symptom in common. They cannot start doing something sexual or lust without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon, and I know we're translating something that's alcohol into sex, but I do think that they are thinking now, and science can only go so far, but this is fascinating, that there may be a physiological aspect to lust addiction. They're like in your body and brain, there's opioid system. Opioid system has to do with numbing and pain relief, etc. And there's certain genetic system, like for serotonin. But there's one called the cannabinoid system. You think, oh, that sounds like cannabis. Well, it's related. It has to do with feeling satisfied. And with compulsive overeaters and compulsive sexaholics, there is this thought that they never really feel satisfied. And think about the marijuana, that people get the munchies and everything is inflated in terms of desire. It's that desire, that feeling satisfied. So it's interesting that there may be a physiological aspect to this. But that's neither here nor there. It's not going to change in terms of solution. But I think the idea of the allergy, they talked about the allergy. This was something that was new, and they were concerned about that a doctor was afraid to write this. Like back then, this was just a moral failing. So I'm looking at some of the questions we have, which we'll get to later, maybe at the end here. But the idea of an allergy is an abnormal reaction to this. So I think it's helpful for people who struggle with sex addiction to realize, for whatever reason, I have an abnormal reaction to something that could be normal. But I think a lot of people struggle with it. It's a very powerful desire and can certainly be misused. Um, so let's go further here. So we go to pages 12 and 13. I'm going to share a screen. Let's see if I can do this. Yeah, that Bill was greeted by this glowing light bulb of a person, and it was spiritual attraction rather than promotion. And within a few days after Ebby comes to visit, Bill decides just to pray to God and say, "Okay, God, if you're there, please reveal yourself." He's in a psychiatric ward for his third hospitalization. It was so bad, he had the delirium tremens. But God actually comes to visit him. It was that simple. And at that point, Bill says that he felt like he may never drink again. He had so much hope. He really thought he was just losing his mind. Um, and he really didn't know God, but God just began to reveal himself more and more. He's sober 5 months, then ends up in Akron, Ohio, desperate for a drink. But for those 5 months, he felt like if he could just help other alcoholics on the street. So he just went around looking for alcoholics to minister to. It was probably just codependency, but it did keep him sober. He meets Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob was an Oxford group member. He had the solution, but he really didn't get the problem. Bill really understood the problem, but didn't have the solution too well. And so the combination between them, well, he ended up talking all night. The story is kind of dramatic. He's at a hotel, there's a bar. It's tempting him to go there, but he has only so much change, and he's calling all these churches on a reader board. The last one, and he's asking is there any alcoholic I can talk to? And the last one on the list was a connection with Dr. Bob. So he goes over there. And that's how AA kind of started. But for 4 years, it wasn't AA, it was Oxford groups. And it was this absolute honesty, opening up, sharing. You can't save your face and your ass at the same time. And that's what addiction does, is we feel like we can't even share this stuff with anybody. And so it really causes issues. Let's go to page 30 of the book here. And I'm going to get better at this with time. So if we go to page 30, sorry if I'm making you dizzy to get there. I'm sure there's other ways you've been dizzy. There it is. So it says most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. And this is hard. Most of us just don't, and certainly we don't want the label of sexaholic. I was talking with someone this week about this idea of labeling ourselves sexaholic. I don't think of that as who I really am, but it's like being a diabetic. It's important information. I'm not going to go eat a bunch of sugar. I can't tolerate sugar the same way if I'm diabetic. So it helps me be on guard and to understand that everybody on the face of the universe has different sins, and some are more they're more prone to. In fact, the early church called these the passions. And so it says, no person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. And so therefore, it is not surprising that our drinking careers have been characterized by countless vain attempts to prove we could drink like other people. The idea that somehow, someday, we will control his drinking, he will control his drinking, and be like other people. I'm switching screens here. So that's what we do for a while, until finally, it says the persistence of this, the idea that somehow, someday he will control and enjoy his drinking or lusting is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. And I'll say, yeah, it's astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. We learned, and so this is what I do. This W stands for Wally, because Wally is a guy I followed who is a historian. And this lets me know that this is a verse that they used in the early days of AA. And that's why I shared my book pages for those that have them. It says, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people or presently maybe has to be smashed. Okay? We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking or lusting. We know that no real sexaholic ever really recovers control. Now, this is going to sound funny. Like, well, what do you mean? Meaning, Eric, power, my power, I'm never really going to control this. But if I follow God, surrender my God to God, plunge myself into the arms of God, then I'll have all the power I need to be totally safe. It says, all of us felt at times we were regaining control, but such intervals, usually brief, were inevitably followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. Demoralization means you're going down, 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 and doing things you never thought you would do. Someone said, and I believe this, it's interesting, addicts or sexaholics or alcoholics don't have too weak a will. Often they have too strong a will. This thing kicks them in the butt over and over and over. And we just keep on going for more. We think we can control it. It's astounding. And so what it really takes is this deep giving up, surrender, I'm done. Now, if you've done that, great. Move right to step 2. Don't go on and on experimenting, and certainly don't delay. Let's go to page 39. This is interesting. It says, we absolutely, but the actual or potential alcoholic or sexaholic, with hardly an exception, will be absolutely unable to stop drinking on the basis of self-knowledge. Now, why did I have that? Because there are people that go to therapy, and I'm not against therapy. And I think you can go to therapy, and you may go to even a sexaholic or a sex addicted therapist. No, that sounds funny. And a therapist who specializes in sex addiction. And bless their hearts, the trickiest thing is if they're trying to help you understand your childhood better, or why you acted out, or what I call trigger management and all that. Be very careful. It's not that those things are bad, but well, they can be bad in that it's going to inflate pride and then you won't be sober. The proof is in the sobriety rates. People went to this beginner's meeting, 1 hour meetings, 4 weeks. They had 93% success rate. For step 1, they said, are you willing to concede to your innermost self that you're an alcoholic? Please stand. And they did. Then they said, congratulations, you did step 1. And then they would do step 2. They did steps 1, 2, and 3 in one meeting. Steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 in another. The third meeting was 8 and 9. And the last meeting was 10 and 11 and 12. And they worked with their sharing partners in between. And they had high rates of sobriety. In fact, it got better the simpler it was. People go, well, what about all this other stuff? The other stuff can certainly be dealt with in steps 10 and 11. So let's see here. Page 44. Under we agnostics, now I'll confess, I was a Christian. And I thought, well, why do I need to read that? Like, I already got that. Yeah, no, it turns out it was one of the biggest mistakes I did by just hopping around and picking what I thought was important. Really important reading here. So we'll get into it here. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of sexaholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-sexaholic, or if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic or a sexaholic. In that being the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Okay. It talks about, well, what if I'm an atheist? What if I'm agnostic? It says to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. I laugh because a person's life may be miserable. Problems with the law, people wanting to leave each other, diseases, I mean, really bad. And then when I bring up God, they kind of go, oh, really? And it's like, it's come to that. But I think we should be gentle when working with people. Once we sort it out, we realize God could give us so much more than we could ever imagine if we just empty ourselves. So, and it talked about back in this days when the book was written, half of the original fellowship was this type, meaning half the people really didn't have a faith. Now, it's interesting. The original, in the preface, it says that 50% of the people got better. And then people would go back out and come back, and then half of those got better. So it was about 75% got better. And certainly much, much better than what you see today. And it's because treatment centers in the 60s and 70s cross-pollinated into meetings, and the meetings evolved to something else. But I wonder, if you just have any inkling of trying to see if God exists and pray to him, you'll have a spiritual experience. I mean, God's loving. He wants you to get better. He's not going to make it difficult for you to get better. But this is a very powerful statement, and it sticks in my mind a lot. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome lust, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. I get feeling happy just reading that. It's great to find God who helps you solve your problem, especially when you've tried so hard in your own strength for many years. So it says, this means we've written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, we're going to talk about God. And then it goes on to that, talking about. So the thing with this is that philosophy or trying harder with brain power or psychology, or I just believe the right things in the Bible that I'm saved. It doesn't work that way. It's like I have to actually practice steps. I had a friend who was an Orthodox Christian. I knew him when he was Protestant. And for those interested in Orthodox Christianity is Christianity where its roots are in the first 10 centuries of Christianity and continue on the same tradition and practices and principles. But my friend his name's Dan, he went all over the world and didn't know that he was seeking something better, but he was he actually met Mother Teresa, etc., but looking at Buddhism, all this stuff, but he was trying, and he realized people practice their faith. They had to do something. And he realized that in America, we tend to consume it. We tend to think, I'll just believe it and then I'm saved. Yeah. And the 12-steppers, why they were is because they faced early Christianity. They realized they actually had to practice things. That's why there's steps, not 12 principles or 12 thoughts or 12 informations. No, you actually do these things and it works. And if I don't do these things, it doesn't work. So lack of power is our dilemma. That's what this is all about. And if you don't do the steps, you won't have the power or divine energy. So if there was one Bible verse or one statement that helps everything, it's God gives grace to the humble, but he's opposed to the proud. And I'll say that again. And this is in Isaiah. It's also in James. I think it's in other places. But God gives grace to the humble, and he's opposed to the proud. So, not that God's mean, but he's opposing me when I'm prideful. Pride is this inflated sense of self. It's this sense that I can fix myself, that I can use my own ideas, that I can use willpower. I use it like a phrase like white knuckling it. And we can stay stopped for a while white knuckling. And in fact, I believe the lower power, the devil, actually blesses us with some kind of pseudo recovery so that we think, look, I stopped for 10 days or 10 months or whatever. The problem is that's not helpful. Actually, the person who can't stop often is quicker to get it because they're more humble. They're really desperate. So when we open our hands up and we say, gosh, I am powerless, God help me, there is no hope except for you, then God gives grace to the humble. And what keeps that grace flowing is getting rid of ought and bitterness and resentment and dishonesty, being really absolutely honest. I know people that say to God, I don't even want to recover. Come help me, save me, whether I want it or not. That's humble. It's God's grace will come to that. God is close to the brokenhearted. So humility, humility, humility. If you're humiliated by this, there's a kind of strange blessing in all that, because it will produce humility. And Dr. Bob used to say that. This disease humbles us if we let it. And I'm going to go to a little bit of a tangent here. This book is called Victory in the Unseen Warfare. It comes from a book. This is just one section of the book. There's 3 of these. I think one's called Prayer in the Unseen Warfare, and the other one's called Virtue in the Unseen Warfare. But this is Victory in the Unseen Warfare. This was written, well, this is a version of it, but the original was written, I think, in the 1400s. Lorenzo Scupoli, and this was revamped. But when I read this, my jaw dropped. Okay, I'll just read certain things. Avoid self-reliance in spiritual warfare. The nature of our struggle requires that we learn not to rely on ourselves. This requirement, beloved brothers and sisters, is absolutely essential to the victory. You must be certain of this. If you rely on yourself, you will be unable to resist the smallest attack of the enemy. Engrave this truth deeply in your spirit and heart. This little section says, be confident in God alone. We have said it is very important not to rely on your own efforts in this unseen warfare. Still, if we merely give up all efforts in this, if we merely give up all hope of ourselves, despairing of our own ability to succeed in the spiritual warfare, without having found another source of support, we have no choice but to flee the battle immediately, or to be overcome and taken prisoner by the enemy. Therefore, along with complete renunciation of our own abilities, it is necessary to plant in our hearts a perfect trust in God and absolute confidence in Him. Well, doesn't that sound like step 1? And doesn't that sound like step 2? And this is the 1500s. Okay? Since all our strength for overcoming our enemies is acquired through disbelief in ourselves and trust in God, it is necessary for us to understand these things thoroughly. So, our strength for overcoming this is gifted to us, and it's disbelief in myself. And this is beyond lust. I mean, this is just, I shouldn't trust myself for anything. And that's what I try to do every day. But guess what? Someone ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And since that day, it puts the default in my life to try to figure things out and to try to bark up that tree of knowledge of good and evil. I should be barking up the tree of life and to just surrender myself to God. And it says we have to understand these things thoroughly. And I mean, what you'll find is it goes on and on. You just read this and you'll start to. It talks about disturbance of heart. And there's one section which I appreciate, which I'll just verbalize. It says, if you beat yourself up after falling, you can be assured that this is because you were trusting in your own strength. Be assured of that. And because that's an obsession with self. That's like, how could I have slipped? Like, what am I saying? Of course I could slip. It's easy to slip, easy to lose sobriety because I'm a human being and I have a propensity towards this. So how am I ever going to be saved? I have to be connected with God all the time. And so if you can pray and pray and pray, and we talk about forms of prayer, but even if you say, I'm not going to trust myself, I'm trusting in you, God, God will help you. If I begin to tell God what to do in my prayer life, then I'm starting to run my own life. And that's not a good place to be. I think we shouldn't go too long tonight. I could go on, but I think my original goal was to kind of go 4 sessions, but I have a feeling it would be more prudent to just keep this going. I want to do another meeting tomorrow. If you can't attend it, it's okay because it should be recorded. But I feel like if I just spread these out over 6 weeks, people can't make it, or there's the urgency and they lose interest. But let's go to page 46. I love this. It kind of brings tears to my eyes. It says, it talks about finding God and the supreme being, and how, you never can really fully define or comprehend God anyway. So why quibble about that? It says we begin to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. Okay, so we have to take those steps. We found that God does not make things too hard in terms with those who seek him. This one, I will say, this phrase bothers me a little bit. The realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or fitting to those who earnestly seek. Now, part of this is because of the age which we live. This just sounds like anything goes. But if I go back to the 1930s or 40s when this was written, what it means is God's not making it hard. It's not some horrible spiritual cosmic trick that you can't get better. Okay? And so that's what we have to believe. And so here's step 2. This is page 47, I believe. It says we needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there's a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe and is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. It has been repeated, proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Now, this little asterisk refers to go to the end of the book where they wrote an appendix talking about what is a spiritual experience. People were getting powerful spiritual experiences at the beginning days. Oh boy, you poor people. You didn't get to see what I was reading. The spiritual experience happened often suddenly, but there were people that weren't getting that, and so they felt the need to change it from spiritual experience to spiritual awakening. Okay. A good place for us to stop here and is the ABCs of recovery. Oh, this is important to read. So this was step 1. These are called the bedevilments. And they seem to be the opposite of the 12 promises. But we had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view. And this is, step 1, we admit we're powerless over lust. and our lives have become unmanageable. So, to have an effective step one, you have to combine both things. You can admit you're powerless over lust, but if you're not connecting it with your depression, your lack of sleep, problem was with relationships, blocked relationship with God, financial problems, lack of productivity in work, it's just not going to work. You might admit all those problems, but never connect it with lust. There has to be the both parts to step one to have that be effective. So these are the bedevilments. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be a real help to other people. Was not a basic solution of these bedevilments more important than whether we should see newsreels of lunar flight? Of course it was. When we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work. The God idea did. Okay. Yeah, well, you have this in your notes. This is more about a good apologetic and dealing with understanding God. So this I read to everybody, and I just goes on and on and on, because a lot of times when we're struggling with acting out or trying in our own power, we have to go back to this. And these are called the ABCs of recovery. And let's get it so that you can see it. That we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives, or sexaholic. That sounds like step one. That B, probably no human power can relieve our sexaholism. That sounds like step two. C, that God could and would if he were sought. And that sounds like step three. Therapists can't help us. I mean, they can help us, but they can't make us sober. Sponsors can't get us sober. So if I'm shaking to use, calling my sponsor can be helpful, but the problem is I don't want to call the sponsor, I want to use. So only God can really relieve us of this. And so I've repeated over and over, self-emptying, and that's what would be really important. Tomorrow we're going to continue on at 9. I'm going to look at some questions here. I appreciate all the people that came. It's just so much easier for me if there's people. Oh, gee, you can't hear me. Oh, well, that was a long time ago. Maybe it's just as well. It's good to see people. Any questions before we leave? My plan is to do something tomorrow at 9, last just about an hour. Then I think Monday night, 6 o'clock, will be maybe at step 4. If you have anybody under the world to help you just get through step 4, there's a chart. We'll show you how to do it. It's not the chart in the AA book. And then hopefully by Thursday, we'd be doing 8 and 9. And then we'd finish up with 10, 11, and 12 in one session. Yeah, and you will have gotten through the steps. And in theory, it would be enough. I had a person call me. They looked at some video or listened to something, and they're now 4 years sober. They call me up for something else, and they're out in the Midwest. What happens? The steps. Just look for God in these steps, and you will find peace of mind. So with that, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate God, and God have mercy on us, and you have a great evening. Take care. Bye-bye.